The battle had lasted for days, maybe weeks. No one knew anymore. The ground was scorched, the air thick with smoke, and the bodies of fallen warriors littered the battlefield. The Exilari and the Vorten had been at war for as long as history could remember. The hatred between their species was eternal, unbreakable. There were no negotiations, no peace talks, no truces, only death. Torvak, a Exilari warrior, crouched behind the remains of a broken transport vehicle. His dark, scaled skin blended into the shadows, his 4 yellow eyes scanning the horizon. His rifle hummed softly in his hands, charged and ready. The enemy was close. He could smell them. On the other side of the wreckage, Kryn, a Vorten assassin, moved silently, his long, insect-like limbs barely making a sound on the rubble. His 2 lower hands held razor-sharp daggers, while his upper arms carried a plasma pistol. He could sense the Exilari's presence, just as the Exilari could sense his. They had been hunting each other for hours, maybe longer. Then, everything changed. A high-pitched sound cut through the air, a distress beacon. It was weak, but unmistakable. A ship had crashed nearby. Both warriors hesitated. The battlefield was no place for survivors, yet someone was out there, calling for help. They both moved at the same time, breaking cover, sprinting toward the source of the signal. When they reached the wreckage, they froze. There, trapped inside the crumpled remains of the ship, was a small human child. The child was young, no older than 6 or 7 by human standards. Their face was streaked with dirt and tears, their tiny hands gripping the edge of the broken ship. Wide, terrified eyes stared at the 2 towering alien warriors. Torvak and Kryn stood on opposite sides of the wreckage, weapons still drawn. They should have attacked each other. They should have fought to the death. But neither moved. The child let out a soft, broken sob. And for the first time in their lives, both warriors hesitated. Torvak's grip on his rifle tightened. He had seen humans before, mostly soldiers, diplomats, and prisoners of war. He had never seen one this small, this helpless. Humans were a strange species, unpredictable and dangerous. But this one was different. Kryn clicked his mandibles in frustration. Humans were nothing but trouble. They caused wars, disrupted balance, and refused to follow the natural order of the galaxy. But this child, this tiny, trembling creature, was no threat. Then, a new sound filled the air. Footsteps. Torvak and Kryn turned at the same time. A group of heavily armed mercenaries was approaching. Not Exilari, not Vorten, just killers. And they were coming for the child. The mercenaries moved with precision, their weapons gleaming under the dim light of the burning battlefield. They were not part of the war, not Exilari, not Vorten. They were scavengers, opportunists who hunted for technology, resources, and sometimes people. The child was just another prize to them. Torvak's 4 yellow eyes narrowed. He recognized the markings on their armor. The Black Moss Syndicate. Ruthless. Efficient. They didn't care who they killed as long as there was profit in it. They wouldn't hesitate to take the child and sell them to the highest bidder. Kryn shifted his stance, mandibles twitching. He had fought the Syndicate before. They were dangerous, unpredictable. If they got their hands on the child, the human would never be seen again. The child let out a small, frightened whimper. The mercenary leader stepped forward, his armored boots crunching against the rubble. His helmet's visor glowed red as he spoke. "Step aside. That cargo belongs to us." Torvak's grip on his rifle tightened. Not cargo. A child. The leader chuckled. A very valuable child. He gestured toward his men. "Take it." The moment they moved, both Torvak and Kryn reacted at the same time. Torvak fired his plasma rifle, the energy blast tearing through the first mercenary's chest. Kryn leaped forward with terrifying speed, his blade slicing through another before the body even hit the ground. The remaining mercenaries hesitated. They had expected an easy job, an abandoned child, maybe a wounded survivor. not two elite warriors from enemy factions working together. The leader snarled, "Kill them." Gunfire erupted. Torvak dove for cover, his rifle humming as he fired back in precise bursts. Kryn was already moving, his bladed arms slashing through armor and flesh. The two warriors fought with brutal efficiency, neither speaking, neither hesitating. They weren't allies. They weren't friends. But in that moment, they had a common enemy. The child clung to the wreckage, eyes wide, watching as the monsters that had been trying to kill each other only moments ago now fought side by side. One of the mercenaries broke through, dodging past the fight, reaching for the child. The child screamed. Torvak reacted instantly. He tackled the mercenary, his claws crushing the man's throat. Kryn moved in a blur, severing the last attacker's head with a clean slice. Silence. The battlefield was littered with bodies, smoke rising from the charred remains of the Syndicate squad. Torvak and Kryn turned to face each other. The Xilari warrior still held his rifle. The Vorten assassin still gripped his blades. The war between their species had not ended. They were still enemies. But then the child reached out. Small, trembling fingers grabbed the edge of Torvak's armor. The human looked up at him with wide, teary eyes, silent, afraid. Kryn exhaled slowly. Torvak looked down at the child, then back at Kryn. The war could wait. For now, there was only one thing that mattered. The child needed to be protected. The battlefield still smoldered under the darkened sky, the air thick with the scent of burnt metal and blood. The bodies of the Syndicate mercenaries lay scattered, their weapons cooling in the dust. In any other situation, Kryn and Torvak would have turned their weapons on each other the moment the last enemy fell. Instead, they both remained still, breathing heavily, their eyes locked onto the trembling human child between them. The child had stopped crying, but their small hands still clutched the fabric of Torvak's armor. They were covered in dirt and bruises, their eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. They looked at Torvak, then at Kryn, their mind trying to make sense of the creatures that had just fought so violently to protect them. Kryn was the first to break the silence. His voice was cold, edged with calculation. "We need to leave. More will come." Torvak glanced down at the child. They were too weak to walk far. His 4 yellow eyes shifted back to Kryn. "Where?" Kryn's mandibles twitched in irritation. He had no reason to trust the Xilari warrior. The war between their species had been raging for decades, and Torvak's kind had slaughtered many of his own. But abandoning the child wasn't an option. Even Kryn, trained from birth to be a ruthless assassin, couldn't ignore the unspoken rule that no one harmed a defenseless child. "We find shelter," Kryn finally said. "Somewhere safe, somewhere hidden." Torvak frowned but gave a small nod. He reached down, carefully picking up the child. The small human barely reacted, their body limp with exhaustion. They had likely been running or hiding for days, maybe even longer. The two warriors moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, their sharp instincts guiding them away from the dangers of the ruined city. The war had turned this place into a graveyard, buildings reduced to skeletal remains, vehicles burnt to twisted husks. Every step they took was a reminder of the destruction their species had brought upon this world. After what felt like hours, they found an abandoned structure that still had intact walls and a roof. It was a miracle that anything was left standing at all. Torvak entered first, scanning the area for threats. Kryn followed, his every movement silent, eyes flicking toward the child now resting in the Xilari's arms. Torvak carefully placed the child on a patch of cloth that could serve as a makeshift bed. The small human stirred, letting out a soft, tired sigh. Kryn watched. "They won't survive without food and water." Torvak grunted. "I know." A brief silence passed between them. Finally, Kryn spoke again, his tone carrying the weight of reluctant acceptance. "I'll find supplies." Torvak nodded but didn't let his guard down. Kryn was a Vorten assassin, trained in deception and ambush. Turning his back on him would be foolish, but for now, they had an unspoken truce. Kryn disappeared into the night, leaving Torvak alone with the sleeping child. Torvak sat down, his heavy frame settling against the cold wall. His gaze lingered on the human, small and fragile, yet somehow capable of making two sworn enemies risk their lives. He didn't know what fate had planned, but one thing was clear: this child had changed everything. The cold wind howled through the ruined city, carrying with it the distant echoes of gunfire and the occasional scream. War had turned this place into a wasteland, a place where survival was a privilege few could afford. Torvak sat against the wall, his massive frame casting a shadow over the small human child who slept fitfully beside him. His 4 yellow eyes scanned the darkness, his sharp hearing picking up every movement outside. Somewhere out there, Kryn was hunting for supplies, or possibly planning a betrayal. Torvak wouldn't be surprised if the Vorten assassin turned on him the moment an opportunity presented itself. The child stirred, their small fingers twitching in their sleep. Torvak didn't know much about humans, but he could tell that this one had been through hell. The bruises on their arms, the dirt smeared across their face. This child had seen horrors that no young one should ever witness. A part of him, one he didn't often acknowledge, felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Protectiveness. His kind had never been gentle. The HFY were warriors, conquerors who saw weakness as a disease that needed to be eradicated. And yet, here he was, sitting beside a sleeping human child, guarding them as if they were his own blood. The sound of footsteps made his muscles tense. He grabbed his weapon, ready to strike, but relaxed slightly when Kryn stepped through the doorway. The Vorten carried a small pack slung over his shoulder. His reptilian features were unreadable, but his eyes flickered to the child before he tossed the bag toward Torvak. Food, water. Kryn's voice was clipped, emotionless. I took what I could find. Torvak opened the bag and pulled out a small container of nutrient paste. It wasn't much, but it would keep the child alive. He carefully lifted the human into a sitting position, offering them the container. The child's eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and exhaustion. Eat, Torvak said, his voice gentler than he intended. The child hesitated, looking between the two alien warriors, but hunger won over fear. They took the food, eating in slow, careful bites. Kryn leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. We need to move soon. The Syndicate will send more. Torvak grunted. And where do you suggest we go? Kryn's mandibles twitched. There's an old supply bunker 2 miles from here. It'll be safer than this. Torvak considered the option. The Vorten was right. They couldn't stay here, but trust was still an issue. The child looked up, their voice small but clear. Are we safe? Torvak hesitated before answering. For now. Kryn watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. He had never cared for HFY warriors. They were brutes, incapable of strategy beyond brute force, and yet he was beginning to realize that Torvak was different. He was no mindless killer. Kryn sighed, pushing off the wall. We leave at dawn. Torvak nodded, settling back into his watchful stance. The child finished their meal and curled back into sleep, their small form pressing against Torvak's side for warmth. He stiffened at first, unsure how to react, but eventually relaxed. As the night dragged on, both warriors remained silent, their thoughts heavy with uncertainty. They were enemies, thrown together by circumstance, but something had changed. Neither of them could deny it now. This human child had bound them together in a way neither had expected. The ruins stretched far into the distance, their skeletal remains whispering of a world that once thrived. Smoke curled from distant fires, and the air carried the scent of scorched metal and blood. The child slept, their tiny form curled against Torvak's massive side, their breaths soft and even. Kryn watched from the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness outside. The Syndicate's hunters would come soon. They'd always did. Torvak shifted slightly, his heavy armor making the faintest scrape against the broken floor. He was not used to moving carefully, but something about the fragile human beside him made him more cautious. The idea of something so small and weak surviving in this brutal war was unthinkable, yet the child had endured. That alone demanded respect. Kryn remained by the entrance, his mandibles twitching. The syndicate won't stop. They'll burn this entire district to the ground to find us. Torvak didn't look up. Then let them come. Kryn let out a low hissing laugh. You'd die for this human. Torvak's grip tightened on his weapon. Wouldn't you? Silence stretched between them. Kryn had fought against Torvak's kind for years, had seen them slaughter his people with no mercy. And yet, here they were, side by side, protecting something neither of them could understand. The child stirred, blinking up at them. Their voice was small, yet it carried through the room. Are you going to fight? Torvak sighed. No. The child nodded sleepily. Good. You're both my friends. Kryn froze. Friend. It had been a long time since anyone had called him that. Perhaps no one ever had. A sharp sound echoed in the distance. Metal boots against stone. The syndicate had found them. Torvak was on his feet instantly, his weapon ready. Kryn stepped forward, knives glinting in his hands. The child clung to Torvak's arm. Please don't die. Torvak looked down at them, then at Kryn. Something shifted in the air between them, unspoken but understood. They would not let this child fall into enemy hands. Not while they still had breath in their lungs. The night was alive with danger. The ruins they hid in were nothing more than shattered walls and collapsed towers, remnants of a world that had already lost too much. Smoke curled in the distance, and the faint glow of burning wreckage cast eerie shadows against the rubble. Every sound, every whisper of movement, could be an enemy. The syndicate's forces were closing in. They had always hunted Torvak's kind. They had always hunted Kryn's kind. But tonight, their prey was something far smaller. The child slept between them, their tiny body rising and falling with slow, even breaths. It was a fragile thing, weak by every standard of war, yet it had survived horrors that would break even the strongest of warriors. The syndicate wanted the child. They didn't know why. Neither did Torvak or Kryn. But it didn't matter. They would die before they let the child be taken. Kryn crouched near the entrance of the ruined building, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened streets beyond. His mandibles twitched as he listened to the distant march of enemy boots. His people had suffered under the syndicate's rule for years. He had no love for the armored brutes hunting them now. He stole a glance back at Torvak, the massive warrior sitting beside the child, weapon at the ready. We cannot win this fight, Kryn whispered. Torvak barely moved. His voice was steady. Then we make sure they don't either. Kryn exhaled sharply. He had once fought against Torvak's kind, had watched them slaughter his own in battle. Yet now, here they were, standing together, bound by something neither of them fully understood. A single human child had become the center of a war neither of them had expected to fight. A sound broke through the night, a rhythmic tapping against stone. The signal of approaching syndicate scouts. They were close, too close. Kryn reached for his blades. You take the left. I'll take the right. Torvak nodded. He gently shifted the child aside, ensuring they were tucked safely between the rubble before standing. His armor gleamed under the faint light of the burning sky. Then the syndicate arrived. They came in force, moving through the ruins like ghosts, their weapons raised and scanning. There were at least a dozen, their armor marked with insignias of death squads, their visors glowing a cold blue. They did not speak. They did not hesitate. Torvak moved first. His massive form erupted from the shadows, his blade carving through the first soldier before they had time to react. The second barely had time to raise his weapon before Kryn was on him, his knives flashing as he struck. The fight was brutal. The syndicate forces were well trained, but Torvak and Kryn had spent their entire lives at war. They fought with the desperation of cornered beasts, with the fury of those who had already lost too much. A blast struck Torvak's shoulder, sending him staggering back. Kryn whirled, slicing through the soldier who had fired. Then they heard it. A soft, terrified whimper. The child. A syndicate soldier had them in his grasp, his weapon pressed against their small frame. The child's wide eyes locked onto Torvak's, pleading, terrified. Kryn froze. Torvak's vision darkened with rage. "Step back," the soldier ordered, his voice distorted through his helmet. "Or I kill the child." For a moment, everything was still. Then Torvak growled, a low, primal sound. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body tensed. And then the sky cracked open. A deep, earth-shaking explosion ripped through the ruins. The syndicate forces turned just in time to see fire raining from the heavens. Something was coming. Something massive. Kryn took the opening. In a blur of motion he lunged, his blade slicing through the soldier's throat before he could react. The child fell forward, scrambling toward Torvak as he scooped them up in his arms. The sky burned. The syndicate screamed. And then the real nightmare began. The fires raged across the ruins, consuming what little remained of the once thriving colony. Smoke curled toward the shattered sky, mixing with the distant glow of explosions in the atmosphere. The syndicate had brought its full force down upon them. They would not allow a single survivor to escape. Kryn crouched behind the broken remains of a transport vehicle, his breathing shallow, his mandibles twitching with tension. His blades were slick with syndicate blood, but it was not enough. More were coming. Too many. He glanced to his side. Torvak was still standing, though barely. His armor was scorched, his shoulder wounded, but his grip on his blade was unshaken. And in Torvak's arms, the child clung tightly, their small fingers gripping the thick plating of his armor. They had not spoken in hours. They had not cried, not since the last attack. But their wide, fearful eyes said more than words ever could. "We cannot hold this position," Kryn murmured. Torvak growled. "We have no choice." The ground trembled. Heavy footsteps. Mechanized walkers. A syndicate war machine was closing in, its cannons whirring as it prepared to fire. A direct hit would turn the ruins into dust. Kryn's mind raced. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. Then the child moved. They pulled something from their small satchel, a device barely the size of their palm. It was cracked, old but still active. A holographic screen flickered to life. Strange symbols danced across its surface, glowing with an unnatural light. Torvak's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" The child did not answer. Instead, they pressed a button, and the ruins came alive. From beneath the rubble, old structures began to shift. Massive slabs of metal unfolded, revealing hidden mechanisms long buried beneath the colony's remains. Lights flickered on, and ancient machines roared to life. The ground shook violently. Kryn barely had time to react before an energy barrier surged upward, separating them from the advancing syndicate forces. The war machine fired, but the shot dissipated against the barrier in a violent burst of blue light. The syndicate hesitated. For the first time, they were unsure. Then, from the depths of the ruins, something stirred. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the air. A low, unnatural growl, the kind that sent ice through the veins of even the most hardened warriors. Kryn felt his mandibles twitch. He had heard many things in his time, but nothing like this. Torvak tightened his grip on his weapon. His instincts screamed at him, fight or flee, but he did not know which. The syndicate forces backed away. Even they, the merciless conquerors, the destroyers of worlds, had no desire to face whatever had awakened beneath their feet. And then it emerged. A massive form, its body covered in dark, shifting plates of unknown material, eyes that glowed like dying stars, clawed limbs that scraped against the ruins as it pulled itself from the depths. A creature of legend, a nightmare given form. The child stared up at it, unafraid. Kryn could barely breathe. Torvak's grip on the child tightened, "What have you done?" The child finally spoke, their voice small but certain. "I called it." The creature's gaze shifted, not toward the syndicate, not toward Kryn, not even toward Torvak, but toward the child. And then it knelt. The syndicate panicked. Some ran, others fired blindly, their shots vanishing into the creature's shifting hide like pebbles thrown into the ocean. It did not react, until the child raised their hand and pointed. The creature roared. The kind of sound that broke the sky, that shattered the minds of those who heard it. That sent a single, terrifying message to all who bore witness. Run. The syndicate did not need to be told twice. They scattered, their forces collapsing as the nightmare surged forward, tearing through their war machines like paper. The air burned with plasma and smoke. Kryn and Torvak watched in stunned silence. Then, slowly, Torvak looked down at the child in his arms. They were smiling, and for the first time in his life, Torvak felt something he never thought he would feel again: fear.